Welcome into the very first video in the Neuroanatomy video series. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the cerebral cortex, specifically the lobes and gyri and sulci and all those features, as well as some functional areas, which are all outlined on this homepage right here. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. So we're going to start off today with a little story that you might be familiar with if you've ever taken any neuroscience or neuroanatomy course before. And this story is the story of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was an American railroad worker. And one day, while he was blasting rock to clear the way to lay new rail bed, he became distracted by some other foremen. And while he was packing the explosive powder in the hole, he scraped the rock, which caused an explosion. This sent the 1¼ inch, 13-pound rod he was holding through the left side of his face, under his cheekbone, and out the top of his frontal bone. And you can see Phineas posing in this image right here with his 13-pound rod that was impaled in his face. You can see on the left side, so the rod would have gone through here and came out the top, and this completely went through his eye socket, leaving him permanently blind in his left eye. Now, this freak accident did destroy a major portion of his brain, but luckily he did survive. However, his friends and family didn't recognize him anymore. They said he wasn't the same Gage, and this was because his personality and his behaviors were so drastically different now after the incident than they were before. He completely changed as a person. So by the end of this lesson, we should be able to determine what exactly happened to Phineas, which part of his brain was damaged, and why his personality completely changed. So we're going to start off with the basics by defining a few key terms which will help us throughout the lesson. So first up, what is the difference between lobes and gyri? Well, lobes just are basically larger areas. These are functional areas where gyri group together. So this right here, this would be a lobe. This would be the frontal lobe, as you can see right here. And the frontal lobe is going to be made up of multiple gyri. And these gyri are just essentially ridges found within our lobes. So gyrus is singular, that's referring to one gyrus or one ridge. Gyri is plural, so that'd be referring to multiple gyruses or gyri. So for example, this right here, this would be the pre-central gyrus. These would be the pre- and post-central gyri. But moving on, we have our sulci. And similar, sulcus would be singular, sulci would be plural. And the sulci, these are going to be found between our gyri. So right here, this would be a sulcus. This is one major sulcus. This is the central sulcus. Right here, this would be another sulcus right here, surrounding or found between the two gyri. So let's draw this out. These ridges, these would be our gyri, and then these valleys, these would be our sulci. So these sulci, these are going to be the dips or the valleys found between our gyri. And then we have fissures, and fissures, these are going to be long, narrow splittings in the brain tissue. So you can see right here, this would be a fissure, here would be another fissure. And fissures are different from sulci because they don't have a floor. So this sulcus right here, this has a floor, so you can't pass all the way through it. Whereas this fissure right here is an opening. So it's a splitting in the brain tissue, so you'd be able to pass a finger through that. And so what gives our lobes and gyri their function? Well, it's going to be this outer layer right here. This is the gray matter of the cerebral cortex, and the gray matter is going to be superficial compared to this white matter area, which is going to be deep. Now, we also have some deep gray matter areas right here. These will be discussed in future videos, but when discussing the cerebral cortex, know that the gray matter is found on the outside and the white matter is found on the inside. And what gives gray matter its darkened gray appearance, well, that's going to be the presence of neuron cell bodies. And these neuron cell bodies are going to be these structures right here, these little dark pigmented structures. And you can see they extend all these branches and they talk with one another, they communicate. These are little dendrites which allow them to receive signals from other cells. And then once those signals are received, then they send that signal down the axon. And here is the axon. And axons can be myelinated or unmyelinated. And the myelinated ones they have so much lipid in them that it almost gives it a white appearance, and that's why it is referred to as white matter. So myelinated axons are what are going to be giving our white matter that white appearance. And you can see here would be a myelinated axon. Here's another myelinated axon. These axons are myelinated up to a certain point. Some can be myelinated, they don't all have to be, but myelination actually increases the conduction or the speed at which the signal is communicated from one cell body to the other. And so just to recap, we have that gray matter with the neuron cell bodies in that outer cortical area, and then we have that white matter deeper on the inside. So now we're going to go on and we're going to identify those 5 major lobes. We're going to have that frontal lobe first. And the frontal lobe, well, this is going to be involved with a number of different functions. It's going to be involved with movement, speech, personality, decision-making, critical thinking, short-term memory, as well as like things like behavior. It really, it makes up who you are. And so our frontal lobe is going to be found right at the front of the cerebral cortex, right under the frontal bone. And you'll realize that these lobes are named according to their placement underneath the bone, apart from the insular lobe. We don't have any insular bone, but we have a frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bone, which are going to be superficial to where the lobes are found. And you can see here's that frontal lobe again, and then here on this superior view of our cerebral cortex, you can see on both hemispheres, so we have a left and a right hemisphere. It's found at the most anterior aspect of the cortex. Next up, we have our parietal lobe, which is going to be found just behind that. So this is that parietal bone back here. And it is separated from the frontal bone via the sulcus right here. And this is the central sulcus. This is a very important landmark to identify whenever we're talking about the cortex. You always want to identify this first. The way I identify it is I look for this long gyrus right here, and I look for this long gyrus right here. And these 2 long gyri, they're actually connected at the bottom. So the central sulcus doesn't extend all the way down to this fissure right here. So we're going to talk more about that later, but that's how we can differentiate between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And a parietal lobe is going to be very important for sensation and perception, and proprioception as well. So this is where all the sensory from our body is going to come in and go to, and this parietal lobe is going to interpret multiple sensory inputs and determine what it is. Next up, we have our temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is going to be found just inferior to the parietal and the frontal lobes. And this is going to be involved mostly in hearing, language, and memory is a big one, as well as emotional regulation. We have the amygdala found within the temporal lobe, which plays a big part in emotional responses. And then most posteriorly, we have the occipital lobe. This is going to be this region back here. This is mainly involved in vision and visual perception. And then we have one more lobe, which is going to be our insular lobe. And that insular lobe is actually tucked deep within inside the brain. So you can see on this specimen right here, we removed part of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe, as indicated by this gray area right here. We need to remove all those areas in order to expose this lobe, which is deep in there, which is going to be that insular lobe. And this has a multitude of functions. Some of the more common ones are homeostasis, regulation, hunger, and autonomic control. So now let's take a look at some of the more prominent fissure and sulci, which divide the brain into its lobes and gyri. So starting off first, we're going to have that median longitudinal fissure. And the median longitudinal fissure is going to be the one found between our 2 cerebral hemispheres. So this splits the brain up into the left and right cerebral hemisphere. And you can see it right down the middle right here. This is the most obvious and most prevalent one. Next up, we have the lateral fissure, and that lateral fissure is going to be this blue one right here, found between the frontal and parietal lobe. and the temporal lobe. Next up, we have the transverse fissure. And the transverse fissure is going to be a little bit different because it's going to be found situated between the cerebral cortex up here and the cerebellar cortex down here. And it's this passageway right here, and found within this transverse fissure, this is where we're going to have the tentorium cerebelli. Next up, we have our central sulcus. This is a very important one for landmarking on the brain. And that central sulcus, like I said, right here, it's going to be found between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. It's a great boundary for distinguishing where those two lobes end and begin. And the central sulcus can be found by identifying this gyrus right here, which is the post-central gyrus, and this gyrus right here, which is the pre-central gyrus. These two gyri right here are going to extend the entire length of the sulcus, and then they're going to wrap around, so the sulcus is not going to fully extend. And this can actually be seen on the medial aspect as well. So you can see here the sulcus doesn't fully connect all the way down. The sulci and gyri loop around and are continuous. And then we have that interparietal sulcus. So what we want to do for this one is we want to take a step back from this post-central gyrus and go into this parietal lobule. Mind you, this post-central gyrus is part of the parietal lobe, but here is where we're going to have the superior and inferior parietal lobule. The superior parietal lobule is going to be up here. Inferior will be down here. This is better viewed from a superior aspect looking down. So if we come over to this image, you can see right here, this is going to be the intraparietal sulcus. As the name would suggest, intra, so it's found within the parietal lobe. And like I mentioned, here's that superior parietal lobule. Here would be that inferior parietal lobule, and that sulcus sits right in between the two. And then finally, we have our preoccipital notch. And this preoccipital notch is this little region right here. It's a little uptick in the boundary between the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe for that matter. And this is an indication of where we're going to find the intraparietal sulcus, which we will talk about on the next slide. But it's just kind of like a little triangular uptick in the gyrus, which acts as an indication of where that parietal occipital sulcus will be found. And so coming to the image right here, this is that parietal occipital sulcus. Down here would have been that preoccipital notch, giving an idea of where that parietal occipital sulcus is. And it's found between the parietal lobe anteriorly and the occipital lobe posteriorly. This is best viewed from a midline or medial view of the cerebral cortex. You can see we've taken a sagittal section and we're looking at the inside of one of the hemispheres actually. And then finally we have our calcarine sulcus. This calcarine sulcus is actually going to be found within the occipital lobe. It's going to be this structure right here. And this calcarine sulcus is going to be surrounded by the primary visual cortex within the occipital lobe. So this is where visual information is processed. So these two structures are at a 90-degree angle to each other. We have the parietal occipital lobe and the calcarine sulcus sitting at a 90-degree angle. So now I have a little trick that you guys can use to help remember some of the lobes and sulci. So you're going to want to take your hand and ball it into a fist and wrap your thumb around. So you can see these two knuckles right here, these are going to be the frontal lobe. And then these two knuckles back here, these are going to be the parietal lobe. Found within the middle, we have this groove. This is going to be that central sulcus. And then we have our thumb. This is going to wrap around. This is going to be our temporal lobe. This would be the lateral sulcus. If we turn it around, this almost looks like an eye. And if you think of eye, think of occipital lobe. So back here is going to be the occipital lobe. And then if we remove our thumb, we have these knuckles down here. These are going to be our insular lobe. So you have one hemisphere of the brain. Now if we have two hemispheres of the brain, we cross them over. And the space found between the two, this is going to be our median longitudinal fissure. And you can see my right side, or my right cerebral cortex, is going to control the left side of my body, and my left cerebral cortex is going to control the right side of the body. So hopefully you can use that to help you remember how our brain is organized. So now we're going to turn our attention inwards and look at a midline section. So this image right here is a sagittal section through the brain. So this is cut directly down the middle, dividing the body into the left and the right side. And one of the first structures that we're going to see is this structure right here. This is the cingulate gyrus, this reddish magenta looking color. And so the cingulate gyrus is going to be involved in emotional behavioral regulation and autonomic processes. And it's basically divided into three areas. We're going to have the anterior, the middle, and the posterior. And each of them are going to have different functions. Next up, we have the corpus callosum, which is going to be the structure found directly underneath of that. And the corpus callosum is not actually part of the cortex. This is actually white matter. This is a large white matter tract connecting the left and the right side of the brain. So we're going to talk about this in future lectures, but it's good to introduce it at the beginning because this is a very important landmark. Whenever we're looking at a sagittal section through the brain, you always want to identify this structure first as a landmark. So you can identify, where's the cingulate gyrus, where is the boundary between the neocortex up here and the diencephalon down here. So this is a very important structure, and it's divided into three areas. We're going to have the rostrum. Inferiorly, we're going to have this genu, which is the bend. So genu is actually French for the word knee, and knees bend. So this is the bend or the genu. And then we're going to have the body and the splenium back here. And then next up towards the occipital lobe, we're going to have the cuneus. And the cuneus is involved in primary visual processing. And that makes sense because it's found within the occipital lobe. So it's going to be this structure or this region just superior to our calcarine sulcus right here and posterior to that parietal occipital sulcus. So if we go anterior to the parietal occipital sulcus, that's where we're going to have our fourth structure known as the precuneus. So pre meaning before, so the precuneus is before the cuneus. And this is part of the superior parietal lobule within the entire parietal lobe. And this is involved in integrating information related to the sensory environment. So you're going to get all the sensory information in, and this part, the precuneus, is involved in integrating that all together and helping you make decisions based on that sensory input. So now we're going to be taking a closer look at each lobe and dividing the lobes into the gyri found within each of them. So first up, we're going to start in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe has a few major areas, most notably the one that we previously discussed being the precentral gyrus, which is this one right here. And that precentral gyrus is going to be found just anterior to the central sulcus. So here's our central sulcus. We know this because it doesn't extend all the way down to this lateral fissure. And then we just move to the gyrus anterior to it. Here's our precentral gyrus. Now, if you go anterior to the precentral gyrus, we have three more major gyri. One of them superior, one of them in the middle, and one of them inferior. And these are named pretty much based on their positioning. We have the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. And to identify this, you can take three fingers and place them over the frontal lobe of the brain, and this should lay out approximately where each of these gyri can be found. And then next up, we have Broca's area, which is going to be a space found right here. So let's take a closer look at this. So as you can see, we've zoomed into this region right here, and we've blown it up. So this region is Broca's area, and it's composed of the pars opercularis and the pars triangularis. So the pars opercularis, this is going to be the most superior one, and it's going to be just anterior to our precentral gyrus. So this one is going to be standing up vertically. And then we have the pars triangularis. And the pars triangularis gets its name because of its triangle appearance, as you can see right here. I always like to find the pars triangularis first because it's so distinctive in its appearance. It's very triangular. And then you can approximate where the opercularis is going to be. So now we're going to move posterior to that central sulcus and move into that parietal lobe, which is going to be this region right here. And you can see we're going to have three major divisions and then a subdivision within one of our divisions. So starting off first, we're going to find that central sulcus, which is along the midline. We just noted that precentral gyrus. Now we're going to note the central gyrus. Now post meaning behind. So a post-central gyrus is going to be this long gyrus right here, just posterior to that central sulcus. And then if we move posterior to that post-central gyrus, we're going to be in this region right here. And this region is divided into the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, and they're separated by the intraparietal sulcus like we mentioned previously. So this is better viewed from a superior point of view. You can see here is that post-central gyrus. Move posterior to that, and then we're going to have our superior parietal lobule and our inferior parietal lobule. And then found within our inferior parietal lobule, we're going to have our supramarginal gyrus, and this can be identified if we follow this lateral sulcus up all the way to the point where you can no longer go any further. This area surrounding that is going to be that supramarginal gyrus. And then we have our angular gyrus, which is going to be found on this superior temporal sulcus. So we follow the superior temporal sulcus up all the way to the point where it can no longer go. This is where you're going to find that angular gyrus. So now we can work our way down into that temporal lobe, and our temporal lobe is going to be divided into 3 major gyri as well. And these are going to be the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. And you will note they have the similar organization as we saw on the frontal lobe. The superior is going to be the most superior, middle is going to be found right in the middle, and then inferior is going to be found down here. And you can use the 3-finger method by placing 3 fingers over the image to estimate where each of these lobes will be, but some of the boundaries are pretty well defined. Now, if we were to take this temporal lobe, the superior temporal gyrus, and reflect it laterally, we would expose 3 long gyri. And these are known as the transverse temporal gyri. So you can see this superior portion of the temporal lobe is still intact, but we've just reflected it back and pulled it back, and we've exposed these transverse temporal gyri. And these are not to be confused with the insular cortex, which is going to be found right here. So now let's flip the brain on its head and look at the inferior aspect and identify some of the gyri down there. Starting off first, we're going to have the parahippocampal gyrus. And this parahippocampal gyrus is going to be just lateral to the midline. So here is where we would have our brainstem, and you can see the brainstem and the cerebellum have both been removed, and we're exposing all the gyri on the inferior surface of the cerebral cortex. And the most medial gyrus is going to be this parahippocampal gyrus. And this parahippocampal gyrus, this is actually going to be the continuation of that cingulate gyrus. So if you remember the cingulate gyrus along the midline, just superior to the corpus callosum, goes from anterior to posterior. And as it does so, the posterior part of the cingulate gyrus continues with this parahippocampal gyrus as it wraps around. And we can follow this parahippocampal gyrus all the way to the end, where it ends as the uncus. And this uncus is going to be this little bulb region right here. And then if we move just lateral to our parahippocampal gyrus, we're going to have our fusiform gyrus. So this is the long gyrus found just lateral to the parahippocampal gyrus, and it's going to be found just medial to our inferior temporal gyrus, as we saw in the previous slide. So right here, this is that fusiform gyrus. So now we've worked our way all the way to the most posterior aspect of the brain, that being the occipital lobe, and we're going to take this region and blow it up right here. And you can see it's divided into 3 regions, similar to like we saw in the frontal and the temporal lobes. They're going to be the superior occipital gyrus, the middle occipital gyrus, and the inferior occipital gyrus. So our superior occipital gyrus, this is going to be the most closest to the midline. It's going to be found on the most superior aspect. And then we have this large middle portion right here that's kind of triangular in shape. And this just basically fills in the space between the superior occipital gyrus and the inferior occipital gyrus right here. And then finally, we've made our way all the way to our last lobe, which is our insular lobe. And if we take a closer look at the insular lobe, you can see it has a very distinctive appearance. It's separated right here between 3 gyri on this side and then 2 gyri on this side. And if you look at these, they're a lot longer than the 3 anterior gyri. So we have our short gyri of the insula, which is the anterior lobe right here. And then we have our long gyri of the insula, which is our posterior lobe back here. And remember, these can only be seen when we remove part of that frontal, parietal, and temporal lobe to expose that insular cortex. So now we're going to talk about some of the functional areas found within the cerebral cortex. And functional areas are just basically specific locations where certain functions are performed. For example, in our frontal lobe, we discussed how it has so many different functions, but those functions are actually spread out across the frontal lobe. So the first one that we'll talk about is the primary motor area. And the primary motor area is going to be found on that precentral gyrus. It basically takes up the entire real estate on the precentral gyrus. In that primary motor area, well, this is going to be responsible for motor output, so sending signals to cause our muscles to move. And that primary motor cortex is going to work in conjunction with 2 areas, specifically the premotor area and the supplementary motor area. Both of them are going to be found anterior to that primary motor area. And the premotor area is going to be found laterally, and it is involved in higher order planning of motor movement. So this is more involved in coordinating and planning out a movement before you perform it. So this will think it, then it will send it to here, and then this will send it out. And it also works in conjunction with our supplementary motor area, which contains a postural motor map. So this helps us coordinate movements using multiple limbs and perform very complex things by communicating between the premotor area, the supplementary motor area, and then sending those to that primary motor area. So these will all work together to plan a movement before sending it out. Then next up, we have our prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex, this is going to be found in the most anterior aspect of our frontal lobe. It's this big, large orange area right here. And this is involved in cognition and executive functioning, our behavior and personality, decision making, and impulse control, as well as short-term memory and things like that. So this really separates us from other animals because they don't have these sort of cognitive and executive functioning behaviors like we have. So this prefrontal cortex, this is really important for determining, the kind of person you are, your personality, as well as how you behave around others, so your behaviors. And then found within our premotor area, we're going to have our frontal eye field as well as our Broca's area. So the frontal eye field is going to be this region right here, and it's on the posterior aspect of that middle frontal gyrus, and it is involved in voluntary motor eye movements as well as conjugate gaze, so moving both eyes in the same direction at once, and saccadic eye movement. So this is important for reading. It's shifting to follow an object. And then again, we have Broca's area, and this is involved in speech production. So this controls the motor output that allows you to produce the words to communicate. So now we're going to work our way into that parietal lobe, and we're going to identify that primary somatosensory cortex. So just like we had a primary motor cortex in that pre-central gyrus, we have a somatosensory cortex in that post-central gyrus, and this is going to be involved in receiving and processing sensory input. So just like this was motor output, our primary somatosensory cortex is going to be sensory input. And once it gets that sensory input, it will then communicate that with our sensory association area, which is involved in complex multisensory processing. Sensory input will come in and it will synapse here, and then this will communicate with our sensory association area. And this sensory association area basically takes up both the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, pretty much the entire parietal lobe. So found both on our primary motor cortex and our primary somatosensory cortex, we have what are known as cortical homunculus. And this is just basically the brain's interpretation of the body based on the cell density found within that cortical surface area. So our brain, in our brain's mind, thinks we have a huge head as well as huge hands and a very small body. And this is based on how much of those cortical areas are dedicated to that specific body part. So you can see here we have our sensory homunculus. Here we have our motor homunculus. So our sensory homunculus is basically all along that primary somatosensory cortex, and our motor homunculus is all along that primary motor cortex. And you can see somewhere like the face gets quite a large portion of our sensory cortex, and that is because our face is very sensitive. We can determine very light touch on our face, similar with our hands, compared to our back, where our sensation or our touch differentiation is not as precise, and that is because we have such little area dedicated to our back. And coming over to our motor homunculus, you can see our face as well as our hands. They receive such a large portion of that primary motor cortex. For our face, for example, we're able to create so many facial expressions and micro expressions, and that is because we have so much cortical surface area and so many motor neurons controlling all the individual muscle fibers of our face. Similarly, in our fingers, we're able to do such precise and fine-tuned finger movements, and this is because we have such a large cortical surface available for those actions. Okay, so now moving on to our temporal lobe. This is where we're going to have our auditory cortex, and this is involved in processing auditory information, and this is going to be this region right here. This is along the superior temporal gyrus, found right here, and it's going to be almost at the superior or the right angle where the lateral fissure goes up into this supramarginal gyrus region. So here is going to be our primary auditory cortex, and if we go just anterior to that primary auditory cortex, we're going to have the auditory association area. So our primary auditory cortex and our auditory association area. And then we have our Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is going to be found just posterior on that posterior border between our supramarginal gyrus and anterior border of our angular gyrus. So it's found right in between those two gyri. And this is going to be responsible for comprehending written and spoken language. So everything that we hear or see, we need to comprehend it. And we comprehend language through Wernicke's area right here. And this has direct connections with Broca's area so that we can comprehend what we want to say. And what we say is actually comprehensive and fluent. And then finally, on the inferior surface of our temporal lobe, we're going to have that fusiform face area. And this is involved in recognizing people's faces. And this is found right here, right on that fusiform gyrus right here. So we have a part of our brain that is involved just for recognizing people's faces. That's how crucial it has become for human survival over the years. And then moving all the way to the occipital lobe, this is where we're going to have our visual cortex. And our visual cortex, of course, is going to be responsible for both receiving and integrating visual information. And once it receives that visual information, it's going to send it to our visual association area. And this is involved in complex processing about what we are looking at and where in the world it is coming from. So what we are looking at is going to communicate with our temporal lobe, as well as our Wernicke's area. So let's say if it's written words, we're going to communicate with Wernicke's. If it's an object like a dog or a couch or something like that, we're going to go into our memory bank to determine what exactly it is. And then where we are looking, this is going to communicate with our parietal lobe. This is involved in complex sensory processing. So like where in the world is the object that we're looking at. And then last up, we have our gustatory cortex. And this is found between our two short insular gyri in the anterior lobe of the insula, found right here. And this is involved in the perception of taste, specifically whether it's sweet, salty, bitter, or sour. And it also measures the intensity of the tastes of the things that we are tasting. So this right here is that gustatory cortex. So now coming back to our Phineas Gage story from the beginning, you can see he's got this large metal rod basically tearing his brain apart. Here is our frontal lobe. Just for some landmarks, here is that central sulcus. So this makes it that pre-central gyrus. Here we would have our premotor area. Down here would be Broca's area, frontal eye field, supplementary motor area. And if you remember all this area, well, this is that prefrontal cortex. And if you remember what it does, it's involved in executive functioning, decision making, personality, behavior. So that explains why our boy Phineas went through such a life-changing experience. It's because his old personality and behaviors were basically ripped out of his head. So his left frontal lobe was completely damaged, specifically that prefrontal cortex, and this affected his cognition, behavior, personality, decision-making, as well as his impulse control. So now we have some practice questions that you guys can practice in order to get you ready for your bell ringer. So you can see we have our cortex image right here, and we have two questions. The first question is going to be identifying structure A right here. And then the second question is going to be, what is the primary function of structure B right here? So if you want, you can pause it and take a crack at it yourselves. I'm just going to go forward and give you the answer now. So structure A, you can see this is going to be anterior. This is going to be posterior. We have superior and inferior. This right here, this is going to be our frontal lobe. Here would be our parietal lobe. Back here is our occipital lobe. And then this is our temporal lobe. So found within our temporal lobe, we have this gyrus right here, another one right here, and another one down here. If you remember, along that superior temporal gyrus, if we reflect that back and expose the inside of it, and we have three long gyri found on that superior temporal gyrus. If you remember what these are called, they're traveling transversely, and they're in the temporal lobe. These are the transverse temporal gyri. So we have 1, 2, and looks like 3. So structure A, these are going to be the transverse temporal gyri. And then structure B, this is going to be posterior. It's going to be posterior to the temporal lobe, posterior to the parietal lobe, and here is going to be that parietal occipital sulcus. So if this rings any bells, this is the occipital lobe right here. And if you remember, the primary function of the occipital lobe is visual perception. So A is going to be the transverse temporal gyrus, and B is going to be the occipital lobe, and the primary function of the occipital lobe is visual perception. Now, moving on to our second practice problem. Again, we have identify structure A, and then what is the primary function of structure B. So again, pause, take a crack at it. I'm going to go ahead with this. So let's first start by orienting ourselves and finding our landmarks. This right here, this is going to be that corpus callosum. This is my go-to landmark. I always find this first. Above our corpus callosum, this is going to be our cingulate gyrus. Here, this is going to be our frontal lobe. Back here, this is going to be our parietal lobe. And then here, this is going to be our occipital lobe. So this is that parietal occipital sulcus right here. And if you remember, anterior to our parietal occipital sulcus, we're going to have that precuneus. Here, back in our occipital lobe, this would be the cuneus. In our parietal lobe, this is the precuneus. And this is also part of that superior parietal lobule. So A is going to be the precuneus. And then B, if this is our corpus callosum, just above that corpus callosum, this is where we're going to have that cingulate gyrus. If you remember, the cingulate gyrus continues down into the temporal lobe as this parahippocampal gyrus down here. But this right here, this is the cingulate gyrus. And if you remember the function of our cingulate gyrus, this is going to be involved in both emotional and behavioral regulation through autonomic processes. So A being our precuneus and B being our cingulate gyrus, and the function of our cingulate gyrus is emotional and behavioral regulation. So now that we've gone through that lesson, looking at our summary and our learning outcomes, this is how you should be reviewing. So you should be able to describe the difference between both white and gray matter. You should be able to name and identify the 5 major lobes of the cerebral cortex and their general specific functions. And then name and identify the gyri, sulci, and fissures found within and between each of our lobes. And then identify and describe the brain's functional areas on a brain image like we just did in those previous practice problems. So that's it for the first lecture. I hope you enjoyed that one, and I will see you all in the next one.